Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of St. Petersburg, Florida's Sunday worship service. It's November 7th. My name is Reverend Ben Atherton Zeman, and I'm so excited that you found us, whether you're on our front lawn in person watching this live, or whether you are somewhere else in the world or in your home. I'm just so glad you found us. I am thrilled to be joined by Beth Stombaugh, who is a fantastic member of our worship team, and we are co-leading this worship service together. Beth, do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Sure, my name is Beth Stombaugh, and I joined UUSP during the pandemic, and I'm happy to be a member here and a member of your worship committee.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you, and thank you for being willing to do this. Together with Jamie Gray, who has a reading in the middle, and of course our the amazing Jamie Gray and the amazing John Arterton, our music director, who has provided the music for the worship service. The amazing Janae Johnson, our religious educator, and the amazing James Mack, who has put it all together. It's always a group effort. There are more folks than that put every worship service together, and those are the main players for this week.
Our flaming chalice is a symbol of Unitarian Universalism. It is a symbol of hope, the sacred, the quest for truth, the warmth of community, the light of reason, and so much more. Before we light the chalice, let us take a moment of silence to center ourselves for the worship service.
As we light our chalice, let us say in unison our church covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
These words today are by Emily Ladau. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, has been a source of immense change, but there is so much more to do. I am reminded of this every time I cannot get into a public place, even though it was supposed to become ADA compliant years ago. I am reminded of this every time I am subjected to stigmatization and exclusion. And I am reminded of this every time I hear stories about discrimination and access barriers across the country. And I know that I am not alone in the struggle. I hope this poem captures the complexities of having a disability in America, a lamentation of the access still needed, a celebration of independence, and a rallying call for advocates to never give up the fight.
Thank you, Beth. Curbing the Heroes by Emily Ladau. I feel your eyes on me, intense gawking, inquisitive gaze, maybe an indifferent glance. Roll on, let it roll off your shoulders. That's what I'm told. So I roll.
Bump, screech, crash. I tried to roll forward, but I hit the curb. The step is too high to make it up and over the barrier of your discrimination.
The kind stranger armed with working limbs swoops in to do his good deed, lifts me up, shoots down my pride. I don't want some everyday hero coming to my rescue. I want to be my own hero.
So I fight to get over that curb, fight to get over the discrimination, not in leaps and bounds, but in turns of the wheel. Each unencumbered turn, a small victory on the inaccessible battlefields that we will flatten and widen and make ADA compliant. till we don't need you and your two working legs to save the day.
How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul.
Thank you so much, John, for that music. We have one announcement this week, and it's the same announcement as last week. The safety team has said, we're open again. The building is open for small and medium-sized groups, specifically in-person, indoors, church-sponsored activities are welcome to take place, and we strongly urge, says the safety team, the continued use of masks and social distancing.
Please be sure to check our amazing newsletter, the UU St. Pete Weekly, for announcements of the many things happening at the church.
This is the time during our worship service where we observe the joys and sorrows in our congregation, in our community. So if you have a joy or a sorrow to submit for this time, please email me, minister@uustpete.org. First, a stone of joy for our music director, John Arterton. Many of you know he had a procedure done at St. Anthony's Hospital last week. It was successful. He's better. Thank you, John. I mean, I'm glad you're better, John. Thank you, John, for having the procedure go well. Stone of sorrow. One of our congregants has passed, Mark McNeil. And so I would ask us all to please send love and prayers to Cheryl McNeil and to the McNeil family. We have one more stone of joy, and it is for someone in our congregation who has just graduated from a program. I received this email but could not find it in time for the joys and sorrows for today. So
We think it's Linda.
we think it's Linda. So congratulations, Linda. And if it's not you, let me know who you are. And then we'll place one more stone for those joys and sorrows that remain in our hearts, perhaps too tender yet to be spoken out loud. And Beth and I will take a moment of silence here, and on the front lawn, if any of you have a joy or a sorrow, please say it out loud during this time. The mystery is that we are connected, even when we feel apart. So let us rejoice in the miracle that makes of the many one. So may it be.
I am disabled, although most of you wouldn't think so, unless I told you. Because most people think that being disabled means you see a person in a wheelchair or perhaps with a service dog Or maybe you see somebody walking with a cane or crutches. But what you don't see are the hidden disabilities that people have. I'm one of those people. I have a nerve condition called dyspraxia. Dyspraxia can be totally disabling for some people. What occurs is the inability of your nerve synapses to fire to misfire. They're not in sync from one side of your body to the other. Many of us have learning disabilities such as dyslexia and psychological issues. For instance, I have a very difficult time with fine motor control. I can't work with tools or sharp objects, or I even have trouble opening jars, packages, bottles, etc. This leads to some very, very psychological difficulties, and you wouldn't know. Such as I suffer from depression, social anxiety, and PTSD. Imagine going back to your gym class in middle school and the teacher wants you to climb the rope and you can't because you don't have the upper body strength to do so. The teacher makes an example out of you and insults you, and you feel ashamed. Your peers laugh at you and you don't feel accepted as normal like other kids. I can't tell you how many times I've had a man come up to me and want to shake my hand, and I can't grip their hand because I don't have the strength. And they go, "Come on, let me show you grip. Do a manly handshake." So he insults you. This response to your physical limitation is very hurtful. People just don't understand psychological impacts that have on your disability. Disability can be like that rock, that big boulder with just a tip that is buried mostly in the ground, because you can only see just part of that rock. Understanding what disability is about education and learning. I would encourage people to be more compassionate and more non-judgmental when they see somebody struggling to fit with society. Just like that rock, partially buried in the earth. You may be only seeing part of the disability struggle.
Jennifer Keelan may be small, but her voice is mighty. Yeehaw! Snowball responds, speeding up to walk into a trot. Jennifer loves to go fast, but she knows she'll soon have less time for riding since she's finally old enough for school. She can't wait to make new friends. The school's not far. Jennifer rolls outside down the sidewalk to the corner, but stop! A 4-inch curve is a cliff to someone who uses a wheelchair. Her grandpa eases her wheelchair over the curve. Though the drop jolts Jennifer, she makes it to the building, but stop! The school says Jennifer doesn't belong there because she uses a wheelchair. Instead, Jennifer and her mom find a different school that says she can attend kindergarten, but only for a part of the afternoon when lunch is over. As Jennifer rolls in each day, everyone is already busy. She has to figure out what's going on and how to join in. She has to figure out what's going on for herself. Since most kids have never met someone who uses a wheelchair, her classmates are confused and even a little bit afraid. "You'll never be one of us," one of them says. Jennifer knows they're wrong, but she's just a friend waiting to happen. But how do you change someone's mind? She's not sure, but she's not about to give up. Jennifer and her family hear about the activists who are working and to make sure that people with disabilities have access to public places like schools. They want to know more, so they attend a strategy meeting. Jennifer has never seen anything like it. The room is full of grown-ups with all sorts of disabilities. Some use wheelchairs, canes. None of them are sitting around waiting for things to change. They're shouting, laughing, planning a big protest to get the wheelchair lifts on buses. So I think you guys are understanding where some of these amenities came from, right? They turn to Jennifer, this young girl. "Do you want to come?" She wants to go. Down, Jennifer rolls to the microphone and tells her story. She leads marchers through the streets chanting, "The people united will never be defeated." It feels so good to speak up for what she believes in. She can't wait to do it again. She's raring, go. She protests in Phoenix, San Francisco, Montreal. Even when her neighborhood school finally agrees she can attend with her classmates, disabilities aren't allowed to eat in the cafeteria with anyone else. This hurts, but she keeps going. And working with other activists revved her up. Yep, she can't notice that she and her sister are usually the only kids that were out there raising their voices. But still, she can't leave all the protesting to just the grown-ups. She knows firsthand that children with disabilities will get ignored too if other kids aren't involved. So she keeps speaking up. So when Jennifer is 8, activists propose a new law called the American Disabilities Act, or also known as the ADA. The law insists schools, governments, and businesses make room for all people, including those with disabilities. Pictures of Jennifer climbing the steps flash around the world. Reporters start talking about the ADA. Members of Congress see the news, listen to activists, and finally pass the ADA. Laws like this don't change overnight. Entrances have to be rebuilt, sidewalks redesigned, buses re-engineered. Slowest of all, minds have to change. So Jennifer will continue shouting and waving signs, organizing and explaining. She will continue fighting for what she knows is right. Jennifer has places to go, and she will not stop anytime soon.
By our hallowed declaration, created equal are we all, a sounding for the ages, a stirring sacred call, but not a promise, not reality, did Jefferson inscribe. For its want, so many suffered, for its want, so many died. And it's on toward our common dignity, in a land whose great promise we now keep. Civil rights and an equal open door, as we pass where so many trod before. Lincoln guided toward that yearning with the slave's emancipation, but a bloody road still laid ahead for those freed within our nation. And then women took their rightful place, sweet suffrage hard won. 2008's historic milestones, see how far we've come, and it's on toward our common dignity. In a land whose great promise we now keep, civil rights and an equal open door, as we pass where so many trod before. Then civil strife and native rights, freedom's flame burned ever higher, and then movements aimed at access, a torch of truth's own fire. Out of bleak and barren shadowlands, through the wailing of the storm, the wind unfurled our banners, a better day, a brighter morn. Equal, we are created equal, given rights, given liberty and more. Equal, we are created equal. Our Creator gave us rights none can ignore. Yes, we are created equal, intrinsic rights endowed, all the same beneath the surface, gifts bestowed on one and all. And these battered truths, self-evident, pass through time from hand to hand. May our leaders join our purpose, for true access must expand, and it's on toward our common dignity. In a land whose great promise we now keep, civil rights and an equal open door, as we pass where so many trod before, as we pass where so many trod before.
Thank you so much again for agreeing to co-lead this worship service with me, Beth. I thought we'd start with birth. When I was born, when I was conceived, and I was in my mother's womb, no one knew that I had fewer dopamine receptors in my brain than most babies. So my mother was not warned that anything was wrong, but that it was different for you, wasn't it?
Actually, my mom did not know that I was going to be disabled until I was born.
Oh, okay.
But when I was born, I had spina bifida or myelomeningocele, which is a birth defect, and it means that I'm paralyzed from the waist down and use a wheelchair. At birth, my mom and my parents were both advised by a doctor not to give me the life-saving surgery that I needed in order to repair my back and to just let me die. Another doctor advised my parents to institutionalize me and just basically forget about me and have another child. So luckily, though, they decided to not follow the doctor's instructions, and I was able to have the life-saving surgery and have a good, fulfilling life today.
Yeah, and I'm glad that they didn't take the advice and that you did in fact live and got to be here with us in this church. This experience is not unique to you, right? I mean, in the book that you read and brought for this worship service, they talk about the history of the disability rights movement and also the history of disabled people. So in my home state of Massachusetts, for example, a lot of parents got that same advice. My grandparents got that same advice about my aunt who was born with developmental disabilities. My grandmother was told she will be born a vegetable, and my grandmother's response was, "What kind of vegetable do you think she'll be?" She said it in a really angry tone, like, "No, you're not gonna do that." And the institutionalization of people, in particular with mental illness, was exposed by Unitarian Dorothea Dix in the early parts of the century. So you did survive, and your childhood was you at first were in a school specifically for kids with disabilities?
Yes. At first, my parents were told that I needed to go to a special school that was just for students with disabilities. At that time, it was called the Crippled Children's Center. And I went there for preschool, and then I went to a special school for kindergarten. At that point, my parents advocated for me, and I was, I believe, the first student with a disability to go to my neighborhood school, and then I was mainstreamed from then on within the homeschool system that I was supposed to go to.
Why do you think they advocated for mainstreaming?
Just so that I could get a better education and to also be with my peers and to be along students with and without disabilities.
Right, because separate is not necessarily equal, as we
Right.
see for ableism and for other issues of social identities and marginalization. My childhood in middle school was, I didn't realize at first that I was different. I actually was put in gifted and talented student programs. One teacher early on, I remember because she had a southern accent, we were living in Pennsylvania. She said, "Ben, you're a really smart student, but you're forgetful." And I didn't, I thought that was just something I was doing wrong, that's something I could just try harder and not be as forgetful. And my first take-home homework assignment when I was in middle school in Louisville, Colorado, I didn't tell my parents that I had a homework assignment, and then I didn't do it. All weekend, I just stared at it and didn't do it and felt bad. And when I got to class and the whiz kid hadn't done the homework assignment, everyone was shocked. But that started a pattern that would continue through college and graduate school of being really hyper-focused on engaging short assignments, but just a complete inability to the point of tears to read longer things and complete longer assignments. So Access relies on litigation. You talked about that in our conversations. And the Americans with Disabilities Act that you mentioned as part of that poem, and that Janae talked about as part of that amazing story, that has needed people with disabilities to have something unjust done to them, done to us. And you say you feel a certain kind of way about that.
Yeah, the ADA was passed in July 26th in 1990, and it was a huge civil rights law for people with disabilities. But I think we still have a long way to go, as you just pointed out, to make sure that it's people are compliant with it and that it's followed. Some of the shortfalls of the ADA, as you pointed out, is that that people with disabilities have to, if a business is not accessible, that they need to file a complaint. And then that often leads to long litigation, which can also be costly.
We're in an institution that is exempt from the ADA,
Right.
religious.
Yes, they're all private, not all private, but most private entities are exempt, and that includes churches. So even our own church here at UUSP is not accessible. As you can tell, we're not up at the pulpit. We're down here on the first level because the pulpit is inaccessible to people with disabilities or in wheelchairs. And the second floor here is also accessible where there's RE classes. So if a student came here for RE, they couldn't go to RE, or they would have to be carried or lifted to the second floor, which is not very dignified,
Yeah.
especially if the child is older.
And any disabled ministers or any disabled people who were leading or co-leading the worship service when we're in person can't do it from the pulpit.
Right.
We in the Unitarian Universalism, we have many very well-known and very amazing disabled ministers, and they could not preach here, and neither could you.
Right.
We can do it like this, but we can't do it up there.
Yeah. And also, any RE teachers that were disabled could not teach or help with RE classes
Now,
unless they were moved.
you've talked to me about a lot of people in Gulfport where you live being great, being allies, and you've also talked about people thinking they were helpful, like that guy in the poem swooping down, but they're not really being that helpful.
No. I've had quite a few experiences where people are trying to be helpful, and I'll be just waiting outside of a restaurant or someplace for a friend to come and not wanting to move, but somebody decides I need help. So they come behind and they start pushing me down the street and someplace I don't want to go, but they think they're being helpful until I ask them to stop and that I need to go back to where I originally was. They also can sometimes, people who are able-bodied don't think that somebody in a wheelchair is just physically disabled. They think that they have, some other impairments or cognitive disabilities. So people often come up to me and pat me on the head or talk in a very loud voice to me or in very simple sentences, or ask a disabled or able-bodied person that I'm with what I need or what I would like to eat instead of talking directly to me.
And I noted this doesn't happen to people I know who don't use a wheelchair. Like nobody ever comes up to me and says, "Wouldn't your body rather be over here?" I mean, I think any of us would find it horrifying that we were being pushed around like that, and yet people do this to you. And you've been told you're a sinner as well.
Yes. Yes. Sometimes I have people come up to me that say that I must have sinned because I'm disabled, and that I must have done something very bad to have a disability, and that I need, to be a better Christian, or, and I've also had people strangers come up to me on the street and ask to touch me and pray over me in order to try to heal me, like the disability is something that's bad and needs to be changed or healed.
And the disability is something that's bad, or in particular, the disabled person is the thing that needs to be changed. That's what we've talked about as the medical model of disability, but there's a social model of disability as well?
Yes.
Well, as I recall, we're not the problem.
Right.
The inaccessible culture is the problem.
Right. Right.
So rather than focusing on how can we make people with disabilities act like people without disabilities, it's how can we make a church that is accessible to people with wheelchairs, worship service that's accessible to neurodiverse people, an online worship service that is accessible to people who are deaf and hard of hearing.
Right.
It's not up to, yeah.
Yeah, and how we can better make the environment more accessible and also end attitudinal discrimination or biases, and also even unconscious biases that people might have. Because I think that's a lot of it. I don't think people are always trying to be ableist or be discriminatory. It's just an unconscious bias that they have, and they don't even realize that they have it.
Yeah, attitudes, and as you pointed out, systems, and even in legal systems, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we still don't have systems. We have systems that reward inaccessibility and do not hold institutions like this church to the standard of many other public buildings.
Yes.
And so you've been basically called a sinner. It's been assumed that you can't talk, that your brain doesn't work, that able-bodied people should order for you in restaurants, and you've also gotten this sort of weird version of what happened to you as a baby, that people who say, "I'm surprised you're still alive."
Right, right. Or people have come up to me and said, oh, you're so inspirational and you're so courageous for being out today and doing mundane things like picking up after my dogs, and that I'm inspirational for doing that. And that's actually called inspiration porn in the disability community, when you're told that you're inspirational, or there's these good fuzzy stories on the internet about people being an able-bodied person being nice enough to take somebody with a disability to prom. And isn't that wonderful that they would befriend this person because they have a disability?
Yeah.
I've also been told that I'm inspirational just to be out, and that if the able-bodied person was in a wheelchair, that they would rather be dead or just stay at home. And that tends to devalue your sense of self-worth once you hear that often enough from people.
Sure. And speaking of worth, our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, I think that's obviously applicable in this kind of case. They're not seeing you for your inherent worth and dignity if they're saying, A, you're inspirational for picking up your poop of your dog, and B, I'd rather be dead than have your life.
Definitely. So I think what I'm asking you today to do is just to be more cognizant about how you treat other people with disabilities, and also to use your voice and your actions to help change and be an ally for the disability rights movement.
Yeah, we talked before about allies and also accomplices. What's the difference between the two?
They're basically the same thing, but an ally is somebody that sometimes people tend to think that an ally is somebody who helps somebody with a disability, and that they're always somebody who needs help. An accomplice is more of that you do it with somebody with a disability. There's a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important to remember.
Yeah, nothing about us without us. It's interesting that this is not just a conversation or a training, that this is actually a worship service, and there's a reason for that, although we are providing information that is educational. This is our theology. As a denomination, we believe not just in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, but we believe that we are all interconnected, part of the interconnected web of existence. And so it's impossible, if you believe those two things, to grab your chair. It's impossible to say you're a sinner. It's impossible to say, well, I would have a ramp up at my business, but people in wheelchairs, they really never come into my store anyway.
Right. Or it's too expensive.
Or it's too expensive. We've talked about reasonable accommodation, right?
Yeah, reasonable accommodation is what employers are supposed to give employees to make the job accessible to them. But in many cases, the employer can just say that it's not a reasonable accommodation because it costs too much, or their business is not accessible and or non-ADA compliant because it would be an undue hardship, especially monetarily, and so they get away with not having their business be accessible or not hiring people with disabilities to be members of their team or
Yes.
employees there.
Yes, and often those reasonable accommodations are, it's a bit of a low bar, and it can be transformative. So in my case, we've been talking about your disability a lot. In my case, I haven't actually come out and said it. I am a minister with ADHD. My brain specifically has fewer dopamine receptors than what's called the neurotypical brain. And as a result, I have a harder time. For example, in divinity school, I asked for and received reasonable accommodation in terms of the reading in particular. I'm a pretty good writer, so that has not been a struggle for me as much as reading. If I have a short thing to read, I will eagerly read it, especially if I'm reading in community with somebody. But if I have a book, I will just sort of stare at it and cry and never read it. So with that accommodation, I was able to graduate from seminary and become your minister. But ADHD is often thought of as like, you say squirrel and you get distracted. And in some sense it is that, but it also is a disability. It causes folks to lose jobs, lose relationships. And without that reasonable accommodation, definitely lose jobs. And
it's often, I think, harder for people with invisible disabilities like yourself to get reasonable accommodations because people don't see it. And so they think people with invisible disabilities are faking it or they don't really need the accommodation when, in fact, they do in order to be successful.
Yes, I'm glad that Jamie talked about that earlier with her speaking about her invisible disability. I don't know, harder. I feel like I was actually warned by colleagues. I posted on, there is a Facebook group for UU ministers with ADHD, and I posted on National Coming Out Day that I will be coming out as a minister with ADHD, and all of my colleagues told me I should not. They said, don't do it because it might be weaponized against you. And that set me back a minute. I was like, well, okay, I guess if you all say it. And then in talking with you, Beth, I realized you can't hide your wheelchair.
Right.
You don't have a choice
Yeah.
to be out as a person with disabilities.
Right. And I also don't feel like a disability should be something that you're ashamed of or that you shouldn't admit to having because it's a part of me. It's not all of who I am or all of who you are, but I believe it's a big part of you.
Yeah, I was in, many of us are taking the Beloved Conversations online class, and I was just in a small group meeting of ministers for that before you came this morning, and I had my fidget spinner, and I was spinning my fidget spinner. The teachers of that class meet with me every 2 weeks to go over the readings and the work for that class. That was what I requested from that class as a reasonable accommodation. It's not hard.
Yeah.
They call me every couple of weeks. It's not hard. And my fellow ministers, they don't care that I have a fidget spinner. It helps me stay present, helps me pay attention.
Right. And a lot of my students with disabilities would need accommodations like that to learn successfully. But if I, as their special ed teacher, encourage the general ed teachers to let them have those accommodations, they were successful in those classrooms.
So you were a special ed teacher?
Right. I was a special ed teacher for 24 years in Ohio before I moved here.
Fantastic. And then you moved here, and why did you join this church?
I joined the church basically, at first I have to admit, I joined it because of John and James. because I loved their music and wanted to hear it because I was so missing the One City Chorus that I'm in, that John directs. So I started listening to the services, but then I realized that I really thought that this congregation was very liberal, that they were very active in social justice issues, and I also really believe in the 7 principles of UU.
You did research, right? You read up on us,
yeah.
What's the curb cut effect?
The curb cut effect is that the curb cuts like on curbs so that people with disabilities and wheelchairs can go up and down them. They also help other people. They also help able-bodied people. They help able-bodied people with that have strollers with kids in them, and they help other people with older people maybe to be able to access them, so that they're not reasonable accommodations or ADA compliance doesn't just help people with disabilities. It's also good and helps everybody.
Yeah, I was fascinated when I learned about the curb cut effect at Boston University School of Theology. We had a group for seminarians with disabilities, and this is the stole that group gave me. The Cross Disability Student Club is the ones that talked me about the curb cut effect. So in terms of my disability, ADHD, if a class that assigns a lot of reading does something like a phone call to talk through the reading, that would help anybody. I mean, some people love to read long nonfiction, but a lot of folks, not just people with learning disabilities and ADHD, have trouble with that. So like the curb cuts out on the sidewalk, helping more non-disabled people even than people who use wheelchairs, this idea of an accessible world, this vision that we have of a world of disability justice, will benefit not just people with disabilities, but everyone. And that, I think, is the vision that we're going for, combining our first and our 8th principles, since we are interconnected. Helping certain segments of the population really helps everyone.
Right, I definitely think so. And I thank you for letting us do this service today. And I want people to know too that I'm not here today for you to feel sorry for me or to pity somebody with a disability, but just to hopefully have more people become allies and to become accomplices for disability rights and justice, so that the whole world can be more accessible to everybody.
May it be so. There are 32 Afghan families who will soon arrive in the Tampa Bay area, and Gulf Coast Jewish Family and Community Services Refugee Resettlement Office will assist them in their resettlement. This is the same organization who introduced our community to the 3 Congolese families that we have supported over the past almost 6 years, apparently. Based on our experience with these families, we know the resettlement office will go all out to welcome and place these Afghan families. So today's Share the Plate will support their efforts of finding housing, furniture, household goods, medical checks, vaccinations, jobs, language training. Now there's 3 ways you can make a donation today. You can use the Vanco mobile app, indicate that your contribution is for migrant families. You can write a check and put migrant families in the memo, mail it to us at the office or put it in the collection plate if you're here in person, or cash. Put the cash in the collection plate. Whatever the mechanism, please be generous, and thank you.
extinguish this flame, but not the light that helps our minds to see the truth,
the warmth that helps our hearts feel connection,
and the fire that helps us commit to a better world.
we keep this light, warmth, and fire inside ourselves until we meet again. Amen, and blessed be.
How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. How could anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice your loving is a miracle? How deeply